All right. Well, thank you all for being here. My name is Noah Oakes. I am the State and Local Policy Manager for the South Central Partnership for Energy Efficiency as a Resource, and really excited to be hosting today's policy webinar entitled Understanding the ACEEE State Energy Efficiency Scorecard, a review of Texas and Oklahoma. As I'm sure many people who are joining know that this is an annual scorecard that many of us look to see where our states are. And I, for one, am really excited to have this discussion with some of the lead authors and some of the participants who went through the process, and really excited for this. A little bit of background about SPEER. We are one of 6 regional energy efficiency organizations in the nation. We operate in both Texas and Oklahoma, hence the focus on the region here and for this webinar. And we work in both policy, building codes, high performance buildings, and local governments. And our members include everyone from advocacy organizations, cities, energy service companies, manufacturers, trade associations, and utilities. For today's webinar, we're excited to be joined by 3 members of the ACEEE staff. Sagarika Subramanian is as a senior research analyst for the state policy program. She joined ACEEE in 2021, and she's the lead author for the State Energy Efficiency Scorecard. We have Jennifer Amann, who's the ACEEE Senior Fellow for the Buildings Program. And we have Edward Yem, who is the ACEEE State and Utility Policy Director. So as I go ahead, and I'm going to stop sharing here and switch over to the right slides. But I'm very excited to have you all here, and really excited to just talk through what exactly the process is going to be. Sagarika is going to first start us off with a discussion of the overview of the scorecard process and the scores for Texas and Oklahoma, as well as have a kind of a glimpse into some of the lessons learned around the country. And then from there, we're going to open it up a little bit to some potential policy recommendations for the region. And then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you do have questions before the Q&A session, please feel free to put them in the Q&A chat box. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sagarika, while I pull up your slides.
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone for attending the webinar, and thanks to SPEER for inviting us to talk today.
And share.
Perfect. All right, I guess we can advance to the next slide. Thanks, Noah. So just a little bit of background about ACEEE to those who are unfamiliar. We are a research nonprofit organization with a mission of advancing energy efficiency policies, programs, and investment, as well as helping build an equitable clean energy future. And we work a lot across the utilities, buildings, transportation, and industry sectors. I'm on the state and utility policy team, but we also have teams working on local policy and federal policy. And I want to point out that we have a lot of additional resources available on our website at aceeee.org. In addition to the state scorecard that I'm going to discuss, we also have the city clean energy scorecard, utility scorecard, transportation electrification scorecard, many of which will be released later this year. And we have countless research reports and technical resources as well. So I encourage you to take a look at our resources. Next slide. So what is the state scorecard? ACEEE has published this, the State Energy Efficiency Scorecard since 2007. And it has certainly evolved over the years, but it has always been intended as a means to document and compare state efforts to advance energy efficiency across multiple end-use sectors. And so the report evaluates states based on over 40 different metrics or scoring categories across 6 policy sectors, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. And each state can essentially earn a maximum of 50 points across all of these sectors, and then we provide an overall ranking. So the state scorecard is also a way to highlight best practices, encourage friendly competition, and ultimately really share examples from across the country about how states can improve. And this or the 2022 scorecard was the 15th annual release of the report, but we did make some changes that I'll talk about in the next slide. And before I dive into what was new for the 2022 state scorecard, you can see on the left what the policy categories or the end use sectors are. So that's utilities, transportation, buildings, state government, appliance standards, and then industry. And in terms of the point distribution, the pie chart includes what the point distribution is. So utilities accounted for the most points at 30%, transportation at 26%, and so on and so forth. And in terms of what was actually new for the 2022 scorecard, we structured it to provide a greater focus on major themes that we felt were missing from past reports. And so the first one was really to, I guess, consider opportunities to align efficiency with state climate efforts. And so we added a couple of metrics that include, policies where states have enacted emissions reduction goals and where, states that are prioritizing beneficial electrification, for example. And the second big change was that we really increased our focus on equity. And so what we did was we really made a concerted expansion of metrics, tracking state policies that promote either equitable access to or track benefits from clean energy and energy efficiency investments. And for a bit of background, the way we went about developing those new metrics was part of ACEEE's Leading with Equity initiative. And the initiative convened community-based organizations, advocates, utilities, and energy efficiency program implementers to help identify what those equity-focused metrics should look like, not only for our state scorecard, but also our city and utility scorecard. And we wanted to make a commitment to have at least 20% of the points in the scorecard be tied to equity-specific metrics. And equity is not a separate category on its own for the state scorecard. It's sort of sprinkled or mixed in throughout every single policy sector because as should be the nature of equity metrics. The other new addition here, you'll see a new slice of the pie, which was industry. And so we added a small chapter in industry to really reflect in the industrial sector's large potential to deliver greenhouse gas emissions reductions, both through efficiency and electrification. Next slide, please. So let's look at how Texas fared in the state scorecard. I know there's a lot going on here in the slide, but I'll try to walk through all of the different components. So overall, Texas scored 10 points out of 50. And tied for 29th place with Montana, Florida, and Missouri. And so I have a little snapshot of the overall rankings for all the states on the upper right over there, which again, you can look in more detail in the report or on our website. And on the very left, we have the blue table, which shows you Texas's historic rank over time. And it really has kind of hovered around the mid-20s for the last several years and stayed at the same position as the 2020 scorecard. And then here, this middle orange table shows you how Texas performed within each of the policy categories I was talking about earlier. And just a quick glance, you'll be able to tell that there's room for improvement across the board. So in the utilities category, Texas scored 2 points out of 50. And in this category, one of the metrics we assess is statewide savings as a percentage of sales from electric energy efficiency programs. And we do this every year. So this year we assessed the programs in 2021. And Texas saved 0.21%. Which we found was well below the median of all states at around 0.62%. And we know that Texas does have an energy efficiency resource standard, or an ERS for short, but strengthening those savings targets could certainly encourage more savings from utilities and bump the score up here. So we do see that as an area for or an opportunity. There were also some equity metrics that I mentioned that we added this year. So particularly in the utilities category, Texas did not receive points for having included, for including health and safety or society non-energy benefits and cost effectiveness screening practices, or for having an active intervener compensation programs, specifically for groups that would like to participate in PUC proceedings but lack the funding to do so. And this year we had added metrics that awarded states for or awarded points to states that had those programs. In the transportation chapter, Texas scored 2.5 points out of 13. Here, Texas received points for having a high number of electric vehicle registrations, providing incentives to consumers for high efficiency vehicles. But we see that a lot more could be done to invest in public transit while also making it more accessible. And also there's an opportunity to adopt California's tailpipe emission standards and zero emission vehicle program, which are points that we award states for doing as well. In the buildings chapter, Texas got 4.5 points out of 12. However, I will let Jen speak a little bit more about building codes and opportunities for that later. But I will mention that Texas could gain more points. Some of the other metrics that we assess in the buildings chapter are zero energy buildings, so encouraging that, or allowing energy efficiency funds to be used for fuel switching. So that's a metric that I was sort of talking about earlier in terms of aligning efficiency with state climate goals. Also adopting a statewide stretch code for buildings. That was a new metric that we included this year that Texas could do. Then in the state government chapter, Texas received points for lead by example policies. So essentially that requires energy efficient public buildings and fleets. But we expanded our metrics in those chapters. So having a statewide emissions reduction goal, you get a point for that. Setting a statewide goal to reduce energy burden is another great equity metric that we added in this chapter, or having an equity task force that is meaningfully engaging with marginalized communities and tracking progress towards that engagement of those goals. And then in the industry chapter, you'll see a negative point here, which we deduct points for states that allow certain types of large customers to opt out of energy efficiency programs. And so Texas lost a point there. And these are customers that Texas could claim energy savings from. And since we saw that the savings are low compared to the median for all states, this is a big area of opportunity, as well as encouraging more energy efficiency in the industrial sector. And that is the big overview for Texas. So now I'll ask you to go to the next slide for Oklahoma. Great, very similar layout of the slide, but let's take a look at Oklahoma scores. So overall, Oklahoma only scored 5 points out of 50 and tied for 41st place with Alabama. And so while Texas is, solidly a little below the middle of all states, I think Oklahoma is in the bottom tier. Again, looking at the table on the left, you can see how Oklahoma has ranked over time and has pretty much stayed within the bottom 2 tiers of the scorecard. And so there's lots of opportunity here to go up. In terms of the actual policy categories, Oklahoma did the best in utilities, and I mean the best in this policy category for Oklahoma, not the best overall, scoring 3.5 points out of 15. So Oklahoma did receive points for its utility electric savings and natural gas savings. You can see that that's 0.39% for electric savings, and then 0.36% for, that should say, both natural gas and unregulated fuel savings. However, Oklahoma does not have an energy efficiency resource standard, again, which is something that we do score on. And so maybe, strengthening targets there as well would help it rise in the ranks. And similar to Texas, Oklahoma does not have some of the equity-related utility policies. So the intervenor compensation I was talking about, or including health and safety or other non-energy benefits in cost-effectiveness screening. In transportation, Oklahoma scored 2 points out of 13. So we noticed that Oklahoma's reduction in vehicle miles traveled per capita. So that's a metric that we score on. Oklahoma also has a freight plan in place. So that includes strategies to promote an efficient freight network. However, so again, similar to Texas and many states, we're seeing that Oklahoma is not focused on encouraging efficient public transportation systems or electric vehicles and the supporting infrastructure. In the building side, Oklahoma scored -1 out of 12. So there's tons and tons of opportunities there to go up. And again, this negative point is because we deduct points for states that prohibit the use of efficiency funds for fuel switching. And so Oklahoma can do more, at least to rise in the ranks for the scorecard, by adopting much more stringent and current residential commercial building codes, performing energy code compliance study. That's something we look at in the scorecard, encouraging zero energy buildings and more. And then similar to Texas, Oklahoma allows large customers to opt out of energy efficiency programs. And as we know, the potential savings are really limited by this. And so those are the only 2 metrics where we actually deduct points for states. Next slide, please. All right, and now I wanted to compare Texas and Oklahoma regionally. The next slide. This is not, I think, a perfect delineation of all the regions, but this is what we use. And so if you look towards the bottom right, that's the southeastern/southern region that I'll be talking about. And I overlaid the rankings for the overall rankings for those states on top of the states over here. And so you can see that there is a lot of variation in performance even within the southern/southeastern region. And I'm going to call out Virginia over here, which was ranked first in the Southeast at number 20 overall, and has really taken some important steps to ramp up energy efficiency programs in recent years through their 2020 Virginia Clean Economy Act, and also their participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which is a cap and invest program, from which specifically in Virginia, those auction proceeds are used mainly towards low-income energy efficiency programs. And so that's quite impactful there. And then, of course, you can see 49, you have South Carolina. So there's a ton of variation here. Next slide. And then again, I wanted to put all of the scores into one bar chart, comparing all of the states with one another. And you can see that Virginia scored the best. Texas and Oklahoma lie somewhere in the middle. Texas does better than Oklahoma. And then the very last bar, all the way to the right, is the national median score. And I think that really exemplifies that regionally there's a lot to be improved upon. Next slide. And then I thought it might be useful to go over some of the overall key findings from the 2022 state scorecard. So we have seen some states strengthen their energy efficiency resource standard policy, or the EERS, in recent years, like Maryland, Virginia, as I was talking about as well. In terms of equity, we're seeing a small but growing number of states that are making progress towards advancing equitable energy efficiency policies and programs. And these efforts are important to reduce energy burdens, address access to programs, and improve health and environmental effects for those who have been either historically been underserved by programs or underrepresented in the actual policymaking and planning processes. And, I would be remiss to mention that 34 states in the scorecard scored less than half the points available for equity-related metrics across all policy areas. So there is a lot of improvement that needs to be made across the board in terms of integrating equity into our energy efficiency policies and programs. On the building side, we're continuing to see some states move to adopt stronger building energy codes. And then to address the existing building stock, we're also seeing a few states adopt a building performance standard, which sets a ceiling on a building's annual energy usage or associated greenhouse gas emissions, and then lowers that limit over time. So 3 states, Washington, Colorado, and Maryland, plus DC, have passed building performance standard legislation in recent years. And then in terms of vehicle efficiency, we saw more states embrace stronger clean car rules. So I was mentioning before California's vehicle emission standards and zero emission vehicle program. That's something that we give points to states for, and we're seeing more states embrace those rules. And of course, even though vehicle electrification is very important, we also need to be seeing a shift towards improving the overall efficiency of transportation systems through either better public transit options, and then building the infrastructure to support those options and making it accessible to people who may not be able to afford electric vehicles in the future, now or in the future. And then appliance standards, which I didn't discuss much, is a very important policy as well. And they're really critical to helping consumers save on utility bills, which is particularly important now as energy costs rise, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and saving energy. And so we saw a few states also adopt state appliance standards. So that was Maryland, New Jersey, Oregon, Washington, New York. Some of those states have done that, and good models to look at. Next slide. And here are just some general key state strategies for energy efficiency that we highlight in the report. I've mentioned most of these already in the presentation, but just to drive the point home a little bit. So the first is to establish a strong multi-year energy efficiency resource standard to really encourage utility savings investment. Again, as more than half of the states have done this already, and I think coupling that with strong performance incentives to further motivate utility investment. And then in the transportation sector, adopting stringent tailpipe emission standards, as well as standards and incentives for zero emissions and electric vehicles, and improving the overall efficiency of transportation systems. On equity, ensuring that energy efficiency and clean energy investments are inclusive and that benefits accrue to all communities, especially those that are overburdened with high energy costs or have been historically underserved. In the building sector, updating building energy codes and taking steps to ensure compliance through periodic studies and supporting code training for builders and code officials. And then last but not least is adopting cost-effective efficiency standards for appliances, equipment, lighting, and plumbing products. And that should be the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Sagarika. And we actually have a couple of questions. If you don't mind, we'll start there, and then, or Edward, I know you mentioned that you might want to jump on something at the end here.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add, by the way, yeah, thanks, Sagarika. I just wanted to chime in on one note on in the regulatory context of improving energy efficiency use or getting a greater deployment of energy efficiency, which is the benefit cost test. Sort of improving the benefit cost test and broadening how we view the value of energy efficiency. And one that I like to particularly recommend in this setting is really starting to view energy efficiency as a real resource for reducing risk and increasing reliability and resilience. And one of my former colleagues wrote a topic brief. It's a pretty brief, fairly short topic brief on this topic. We call it the 3R of energy efficiency: risk, reliability, and resilience. And I'll sort of just paste the link to that topic brief here. And I mean, so generally the idea is that in terms of risk, energy efficiency really does reduce the system risk because it adds to the supply resource diversity. It's a modular resource. It doesn't take multiple years to build. And in terms of reliability, I mean, to the extent that it increases reserve margin, to the extent that reserve margin is a percentage of expected load, and if you reduce that load, then you have just now increased the reserve margin for your reliability. And in terms of resilience, it also reduces the amount of backup power needs. And when you really improve your the building envelope, it really increases the resilience of the building in the context of extreme weather. It allows residents to stay in their homes longer in the extreme heat and cold, and we know that that's the safest place to be for residents. So the goal is to keep them in their home as long as possible. So their efficiency really does deliver very tangible, real value to the system, and in terms of the system risk and reliability and resilience. The problem is that often in the regulatory context, these values are not adequately considered when you do the cost effectiveness of energy efficiency measures, or when you weigh the benefits and costs of energy efficiency. And we really do recommend that these values be carefully considered and quantified, and many of them actually are quantifiable. And I'll put in another link in the chat where there is now a manual called the National Standard Practice Manual for the costs and benefits of distributed energy resources. And there's a particular appendix, and I'll just put that in the chat here as well, that gives practitioners, regulators, and just stakeholders in the energy efficiency space a fairly detailed guide for how you quantify all of these benefits, including risk, equity, resilience, and reliability. That's not really highly prescriptive, but it allows the individual jurisdiction and policymakers within each individual jurisdiction to really select appropriate values for these things so that they can be adequately considered. So I would just encourage the folks here to just take a look at that. So that's it.
Excellent. That actually rolls right into one of our questions and also kind of the agenda we have here. From Joe Colbert, who's asking, in ACEEE's opinion, given the legislative session is now open here in Texas, what are kind of the top 2-3 things that Texas could look to adopt or implement or enhance that would be kind of the net greatest benefit in your mind, as well as maybe a couple long-term, maybe 1 to 2 long-term potential recommendations? And that, like I said, kind of goes towards our next step, which is looking at some of these lessons learned and trying to apply them to the region. So I'll kind of open that up to you guys.
Jen, would you like to take this on and get your thoughts first?
Sure, I can jump in first. So I think one of the biggest things Texas could do is adopt more stringent targets and goals for their energy efficiency resource standard. You know, they really led the nation out of the gate to get started with this policy. And over the years, we've seen, you know, more than half of the states adopt ERSs with much more stringent targets, you know, and adopting and meeting again and again those goals. And Texas has really stagnated in that area. So I think that would be one of the most important things. And in fact, I answered, Joe had a question earlier about why Texas looked so good in the 2007 scorecard and the first scorecard. And I think a lot of that was due to their early work on the ERS. So I think that would really, you know, provide a signal to utilities throughout the state to up their game and really provide greater opportunities and turn more of ratepayer dollars back to ratepayers through efficiency programs. We've seen that be a really big and important driver in other states. So to me, that's kind of top of the list. I think there are some other important mechanisms that could be done. There are a lot of opportunities for heat pumps to provide much better, much more efficient heating and cooling for residents in Texas. So I think allowing fuel switching would be an important one, you know, sending some different signals to the PUC about that would also be really important. And then, you know, on the building side, I think, you know, Texas in particular has done a good job on, you know, a fairly good job on codes, but further adoption of codes and maybe even a codes pathway to zero energy, zero carbon buildings over the next decade is something that we've seen as a really successful mechanism for driving builders to, you know, adopt. And also to think about, you know, to put in, you know, milestones that can help drive other policy development. You know, stronger codes at the state level could really help those jurisdictions that don't have the capacity to look at and adopt stronger codes on their own. But we've seen real success in many jurisdictions in Texas adopting stronger codes than the statewide code, and that's really helping move their buildings forward and save money for consumers.
Excellent, thank you. And go ahead, Edward.
Oh no, I just wanted to also see if Sagarika wanted to chime in with her one or two favorites. But
I mean, Jen, you said it. You said it perfectly. ERS is strengthening. I mean, as you said, Texas has done fairly well in building codes, but even strengthening that further, and specifically in the scorecard, we've, you know, added this new metric on states that can adopt a stretch code that goes above the statewide code. So there's work there. And then I would say in terms of transportation, again, having some sustainable funding sources for public transit, and also, of course, you know, perhaps adopting California's tailpipe emission standards or zero emission vehicle program. Although we are seeing a high number of EV registrations in Texas, but also supporting the infrastructure around electric vehicles. And so, yep, those are just a couple more off the top of my head.
One that I would certainly recommend in the context of system risk and extreme weather is really setting a pretty good target for target that's related to reducing peak demand. I think peak load, any of those like peak demand savings measures that are well combined with efficiency and demand response measures, I think that can really drive really good results in the short term.
Excellent.
One last thing that I would just throw out there is I think both in Texas and Oklahoma, we see you know, virtually no policies for existing buildings, or, you know, no drive to improve, you know, or to kind of set a stage for improving existing buildings. And I think this also goes to some of the equity issues. So where we've seen that there are some policies in place, particularly in Texas, for state-funded affordable housing and for addressing some deficiencies in homes participating in weatherization and other programs for all of the larger set of buildings, including the naturally occurring affordable housing. Doing improvements there are really important. And a couple of policy options there are the building performance standards on the commercial building side that Sagarika mentioned, but also things for the residential sector, such as rental certificates and other policies that can really help ensure a baseline of energy efficiency, particularly for renters who are some of the more vulnerable consumers out there.
Thanks for that. And I think we'll go ahead and just open it up. We have been getting some good conversation and questions. And I see, Robert, you've had your hand up for a while. So I'll go ahead and unmute you and let you ask your question, if that's okay.
Hi, was this for me? No, I don't have a question. I think I inadvertently raised my hand. Sorry about that.
No problem. Well, that helps.
Noah, I think I'm actually unable to post my links because they only go to the hosts and panelists, but those two links to the documents that I was talking about earlier, I wonder if there's a way to share them with all the attendees.
We can. I can send something out afterward with everything, with all the links.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks.
And then,
That would be great. I realized I sent a response to Ruben's question, and I see that it only went to the host and panelists too. So
sure, we can do that for sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, and so for Ruben, I think Jen shared the link to our study on the potential for using efficiency and demand response in Texas, that in the context of the outage that occurred in 2021 that you were asking about. We do have a white paper on that, and so that's the link.
Yep,
That Jen co-authored with Steve Nadell, our executive director.
Absolutely, we can get that out. We have another question here. I think Sagarika, it might be for you here. They're asking to speak to the methodology that reports no gas savings in Texas, although electric utility efficiency programs do produce gas savings. Is there any can you elaborate a little bit into what you've looked at there?
Sure. And one of my colleagues who's left ACEEE primarily worked on that, so I can check afterwards too. But essentially, our methodology is to ask we send out data requests every year to both the state energy offices and the public utility commissions in every state, and we specifically request for both electric efficiency savings as well as gas savings, and then we get the other data in terms of sales and consumption from EIA as a standard way to use that information. And so in this case, I actually went back and I noticed that for a couple of years we haven't been reporting gas savings, and I assume that's because we haven't received that information from the Texas PUC, or it's lumped into the electric savings, and so it's included somewhere. But I can certainly go back and take a look. But I noticed that's been the case for the last several years since we put out these calculations every year. And so I do think that those savings are being either lumped into the efficiency savings or the electric savings, or they just haven't been reported to us and we weren't able to find it online or at EIA, and that's why it's not on there.
Thanks for that. And also, I think sticking with you, Tim's asking about the Texas energy efficiency policy goals and how they're mainly focused towards our investor-owned utilities currently, but there's no mention of the co-ops or munis. How does this no policy affect the Texas score for the ACEEE report?
That's a great question. We do mainly look at investor-owned utility savings for the scorecard, but to the extent possible, we include savings from munis and co-ops. Some of those come from EIA reported savings, and some of them come from the PUCs. But for the most part, I do agree that we're focusing some of these recommendations on IOUs, but there's a a big opportunity for savings from munis and co-ops. And we do have some resources at ACEEE that has looked into that. And
Yeah,
I'll mention, oh, sorry, Jen, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
Just one more thing that, you know, I had mentioned the utility scorecard earlier. So that looks at, that again is primarily focused on IOUs, but that'll be another resource that will come out later this year if you want to look at specifically what the policies are within, you know, the top 53 utilities in the US.
Yeah, and our city clean energy scorecard also dives into and showcases some of the great work that that co-ops and munis are doing, particularly munis around the country. And I know that the munis in Texas are really leading the way, the large munis. In fact, as we did the work for in our work on reliability in Texas, you know, looking at how much more savings were coming from programs that the munis were running, and the opportunities in the residential sector in particular compared to the IOU programs was quite startling. Yeah, quite significant.
Thank you. And Jen, I'm wondering, would it be possible, and I know it's probably a lot to ask, but could you maybe run through some of the high level recommendations from the October report in 2021, looking at the Winter Storm Uri impacts and kind of some of the things ACEEE recommended?
Yeah, sure. So in that report, we looked at, I'm just pulling it up right now so I don't miss any of the options that we looked at. We looked at several, we were focused on the residential sector. And so we did an analysis of a number of efficiency measures and then some demand response measures to see where the biggest impacts would be and where the greatest opportunities might be for savings. So what we did is we looked at, you know, what would it cost for the Texas IOUs to invest in programs for these technologies over a 5-year period. And we found that about $7 billion of program spending would yield really significant, actually not even 7 billion, about 5 billion in program costs would lead to overall savings of let's see, just looking at the thing, over 7 million or 7,000 gigawatt hours of savings, but then most importantly, over 13,000 megawatts of peak savings in the wintertime, and over 8,000 megawatts of savings, almost 9,000 megawatts of peak demand reductions in the summer. So really addressing those reliability issues. Some of the biggest opportunities, no big surprise, as I mentioned before, we're replacing electric furnaces with heat pumps, a really big opportunity, and the vast majority of those winter peak savings. And then also some efficiency measures, particularly attic insulation, duct sealing, and so forth. You know, those I think have a particularly important impact because we know that relative to other homes in the country, existing housing stock in Texas is under insulated. And those are the types of things that help allow people to stay healthy and safe in their homes during a time of a power outage or other extreme events. So that one has a really important impact both on health and safety and resilience, as well as the efficiency savings and energy savings. We also looked at smart thermostats, which are a great option, heat pump water heaters. And then on the demand response side, we looked particularly at air conditioning demand response programs, water heating demand response programs, and then demand response for EV charging, and found particularly the water heating demand response had some significant winter peak reductions. So basically, I think the bottom line, you know, headline of this is that for about half the cost, maybe 60% of the cost of proposed gas power plant expansions, you could get many more savings, address the reliability issues, and provide services that serve residential customers year round, not only, that doesn't just, not just a resource that exists to provide power at, during extreme times, but you could actually meet people's needs, save them save their dollars, make their homes more safe and comfortable at less cost to the state. So, we also shared this report and many comments with the PUC. I have not looked at the recent efficiency rulings that they've put out. I know there's been an ongoing case on that. I'm interested to learn where that's going and whether we might see some additional programs or a little bit more attention to residential efficiency and demand response opportunities.
Thanks for that, Jen. And I'll go ahead and just put a shout out. Currently, the PUC is working on looking into some stakeholder engagement. They've formed 4 working groups looking at the energy efficiency programs, and they're hoping we have a new commissioner as well, Commissioner Kathleen Jackson, who has been tasked with looking specifically at energy efficiency programs. So there's a lot going on here at the PUC and obviously with the legislature. I think my last question that I have for you all is looking forward to some of this federal funding that's coming out, looking forward to the different, both Oklahoma and Texas having legislative sessions right now, as well as other states. How do you anticipate the impact of the IIJA, the IRA, all these various pieces of legislation coming out of the federal level on this statewide scorecard for Texas, Oklahoma, and as well nationally?
I'll quickly jump in because this is a state level scorecard. Federal funding and again, to a certain extent, what the cities do are not exactly in scope for the scorecard. But that being said, so much of this funding will be used towards the state policies that we've all been talking about, rebates for homeowners and so many different types of incentives on the transportation EV side as well. And no doubt those will have an effect on the scores later on. But I'm not sure when those will actually have an effect on the scores. And I think a lot of states are anticipating all of this funding and trying to figure out how to really maximize the use of those funds. And we're hoping that it'll give an opportunity to states that have perhaps not done quite so well in the state scorecard to not, maybe if funding was one of the reasons that they weren't able to rise up in the ranks, that this will be the opportunity for them to do so. And so I'm personally hoping, of course, that will improve energy efficiency and the rankings in future years. But for this specific scorecard, or at least the 2022 scorecard, that was sort of out of the scope. And again, it's at the nascent stages, but I'm hoping it will.
I could add one particular thing, and that I did want to mention. We've given so much focus to Texas, but for Oklahoma, we recently did an analysis of which states would have the biggest impact from improving their energy codes. And the reason that we did this study was because under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or IIJA, DOE will be distributing $225 million to states for resilient and efficient codes implementation. And the first tranche of that money, they're actually working on the applications. That's a competitive process, but the more money will be coming out later for states to apply to. But then there also is $1 billion in IRA funding to support state adoption of stronger energy codes. So we thought it would be interesting to look and see which states would really benefit the most by updating their energy codes. And Oklahoma was in our top 10. They kind of squeaked into the top 10 there. Just a couple of things I'll mention that I think are really interesting. Oklahoma has the highest potential cost savings of any state from updated commercial codes, about 36.8% cost savings. And they tie for the second most potential savings from a residential code update at 29%. And this is despite ranking 31st in construction activity. So even though there's not as much construction activity as there is in many other states, The codes in Oklahoma are so outdated. There have been so many advances in the codes since the time of Oklahoma's codes. I think another thing that's just interesting that I noticed about as I was looking into this, most states have found it easier to update and keep more stringent commercial codes. Oklahoma is one of the few states where the residential code is more stringent, is newer than the commercial code, although they're both from the 2000s, from the aughts. So there's a lot of savings potential there. And there is funding, that's all of this funding will be coming from DOE that can really help the state not only adopt those more stringent codes, but also get some funding to support implementation, code compliance, and the resilience impacts. So I'm going to put in the chat a link that that maybe you can share with the crowd later as well, Noah, on a link to that policy brief that goes over the details of that.
And the only thing I would add on either the IJA or IRA funding is that the purpose of these federal funds are to accelerate and expand the reach of energy efficiency. It's not to replace the money that state and local governments are currently spending. And there is some concern that in some states, folks are considering the federal funds as a replacement of the current level of state and local funds. But really the intent is to just expand on them, not just replace them, which would just kind of put us in a standstill position. So that's the only thing I would add to watch out for.
I think that's a great point, Edward. I think it's the same thing on the utility side. We've seen some states saying, well, maybe we don't need to require as much effort on the utility side. We can move, that funding somewhere else. But I think there will be opportunities for utility programs to kind of stack and leverage the federal funds to support maybe development of longer term programs that they can offer. And there has been some discussion about, as long as the utilities are providing investment to support, maybe round out the project investments, that could be anything from, greater support for to help support and leverage weatherization dollars that have been highly increased through the IIJA, or some of the rebate programs through the IRA, that if the utilities are also supporting those and providing funding and resources to support those programs, they I think there is some question about what kind of credit they might be able to take for the savings there by helping to facilitate those programs happening. And so there could really be some opportunities for utilities to leverage those savings by continuing to offer a strong portfolio of programs, or even strengthen their portfolio of programs.
Absolutely. Well, we are running short on time, so I want to be respectful of your time and all of our attendees as well. But I want to go ahead and say thank you so much for participating and walking us through this. I know it's a Herculean effort every year for you all to go through this and to check all 50 states and all these various utilities and see what's going on. Really appreciate it. I know from SPEER's background, we reference the scorecard, probably weekly, if not more frequently. So really, thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick just to have your contact information out there. There we are. And then just a reminder to anyone who's watching, all of our webinars are posted on our SPEER YouTube channel. And you can also find all of our upcoming events on our website, eepartnership.org. On our calendar, we have several webinars here in the future. Sorry, forgot I hit share there. We've got several webinars in the future coming up on building codes, on City Efficiency Leadership Council, and so forth. So really excited for the future here and what's going on. And again, thank you so much. And I will let you guys have a few minutes back on your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so,
Okay, thanks so much.
Bye.